My compassion encompasses all things. Another address in the Quran, and the address is to all humanity, to cooperate in good work, in piety, and do not cooperate in hostility and sin. Then peacemaking in the Quran also inquire peaceful encounter, peaceable encounter with the rest of society. And here, again, we read in a Quranic verse that good and evil are never the same. So you do not respond to evil with another evil. No, reply with what is better. And then you may find that even with the one you may have had enmity might become an intimate friend. Then in another verse, إنما المؤمنون إخوة فاصلحوا بين أخويكم. The believers are brethren, so bring peace among your brethren, as if the fraternity, the test of fraternity is that you bring peace among yourselves. And in another Quranic verse, عسى الله أن يجعل بينكم وبين الذي عاديتم منه مودة. It may be that God will bring peace and friendship between you and those you may have considered as enemies, if you will show the side of peace to the outside world. And then again, Islam is very emphatic on the value of patience and sabr. This is self-restraint against aggressive encounter by the others. But for those who exercise patience, in the Quran there is the promise that God will reward them without measure, beyond measure. And in another place that they will be given in reward the highest place in the heavens for those who exercise patience and avoid being responding with hostility against provocations. And again in the Quran in Surah 16, Ayah 10, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُ بِالْعَدْلِ وَالْإِحْسَانِ. Allah command justice in the doing of good, that you be good to other people. And with regard to the relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims, in the Quran we read that with regard to those who have not been oppressive to you nor have evicted you from your homes, you should be just and kind to them. This is also the principle that governed Muslim in non-Muslim relations. In the saying of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, there is supportive evidence in many of his sayings. On one occasion, he came to his companions. He said, "Should I tell you about something that is more valuable than prayer and fasting and the pilgrimage of Hajj?" And the companion were eagerly listening, and he said, to bring peace between the two conflicting parties. Islah Zatul Bain. This is the highest act of merit that any Muslim can commit. In another hadith, that people are God's children, and the most beloved to God is the one who is most beneficial to them. An-nasu ayalullah ahabbuhum ilallahi anfa'uhum li'ayalihi. And about gentleness, that gentleness beautifies everything to which it enters. and does not fail to make ugly everything on which it to which it enters. And yet another saying of the Prophet, that a sign of a Muslim is al-Muslimu man salim al-Muslimuna min yadihi wa lisanihi. A Muslim is one from whose hands and tongues others are safe. We have many. That is why that non-violence becomes of primary importance. And we had many figures like Said Nursi in Turkey, Abdul Ghaffar Khan, the frontier Gandhi, and Ghazal al-Makdishia in Yemen, Lala Aziza in Morocco, and Mubarak Awad in Palestine, and many other figures who have taken the principle of non-violence, and that this is the Islamic approach. Then the fiqh literature, Islamic law literature, provides several formulas in order to facilitate peace, from tahkim, arbitration, to sulha, bringing peace through negotiation, to truce in armistice, hudna, and then grant of afwa, pardon, aman, safe refuge in Aman. These are all regulated by legal literature, and these are avenues that are recognized for bringing peace and removal of conflict among people in society. Now, from the viewpoint of the maqasid of Sharia, the higher objective of the Sharia that Muslim scholars have identified to be 5 or 6 in the first place. These are the universal principles that the whole of the Sharia prioritize and protect. These are the protection of faith, protection of life, protection of the intellect, property, and the generation, the family. These are the higher purposes of Islam in the Sharia. In other words, that they must be protected at all costs. Anything that any threat to them, whether real or potential, is therefore un-Islamic. And since nuclear weapon is a permanent threat to human life, and it is prejudicial and destructive of the sanctity of life. They violate the sanctity of life. Therefore, it is forbidden. It is unacceptable from the viewpoint of Islam in the maqasid. Each of these, if I may, itemize the protection of life. So long as there is nuclear stockpiling and the possibility of war exists, whether by design or by accident. And it is also wasteful to have nuclear weapons, for developing it, then producing it, and then upkeeping it. All of it is waste of resources. If that amount of money is spent on human welfare, it will make a big difference. And then it is destructive of the family and generation of the whole humanity, in fact. And it violates religion because the source of all of it is greed, selfishness, and the desire to dominate, and all of these violate the advice of religion. We must not allow these negative sentiments to dominate our conduct and our behavior, go to the extent to stockpile nuclear weapons that kill the whole humanity 1,000 times over. What kind of the essence of compassion the essence of cooperation. Is this what you do to your own humankind? And yet, the realities of human life is such that all great religions have, in principle, permitted war in self-defense. If the opponent is resorting to war in violence, we are entitled to use the same in self-defense. And forbid, but all religion forbid aggression, and all of them also agree that war in conflict gains nothing. No one gains from it. There are also Islamic legal maxims like La darara wa la durar fil Islam. It is also a hadith of the Prophet that harm may not be inflicted nor reciprocated in the name of Islam. And nuclear weapons is a source of harm in destruction. And as zararu yuzal, if the harm has come into existence, then it must be eliminated. In another legal maxim, الضرر لا يكون قديما, that harm cannot continue. It cannot continue just because it has existed in the past. Existence of a source of harm in the past does not justify its continued existence. In the nuclear weapons that we have must be, in other words, eliminated. And then in another legal maxim, dar'ul mafasid awla min jalbil manafi, that preventing the harm, it takes priority over the attraction of benefit. If there is some marginal benefit, that does not justify getting rid of it. Then for also the personality of the Muslims and other human beings, that tama'anina, that tranquility that all religion requires for people, that is disturbed because a state of tension prevails all around us, with the nuclear weapon occupying the prospect and the reality of our lives. Yusuf al-Qaradawi, he has given a fatwa, says that possessing nuclear weapons is permissible, especially if the other side, the opponent, is also having it. But employing it in using it is forbidden. And he quotes a Quranic verse in support that you should be in the state of readiness to face violence in order to intimidate the enemy. وَأَعَدُّوا لَهُمْ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ مِنْ قُوَّةٍ وَمِنْ رِبَاطِ الْخَيْلِ. Wahb al-Zuhaili has given similar fatwa. It says that mu'amala bil-misl is permissible, that reciprocal treatment. If your enemy is having nuclear weapons, you may have it, but it is unlawful to use it. But the Shia scholars, Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, he has given in fatwa in 2003, saying that the production, in use, and ownership of nuclear weapons are all harmful or all forbidden. And this view was also cited by the Iranian representative in Vienna and the International Atomic Energy Agency in 2005, in that position that Islam has forbidden nuclear weapons. Producing it, owning it, all of it is forbidden. And given the strong support that comes from the sources of Islam, we may propose that there should be Muslims should spearhead the cause of peace if some of the countries like Turkey, Morocco, Egypt, Malaysia, Indonesia, if they uh, have a common agenda for peace and work for it, it may make a difference. Should create a mechanism for peace and conflict resolution and utilizes the resource or resources of Islam on the advocacy of peace. Just to make one or two comments on nuclear, there are two main treaties that I may briefly refer to before I finish. One is the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, 1968, that defined nuclear states as one, a state that had owned nuclear device and nuclear explosive before January 1967. These are recognized nuclear weapon states: United States, Russia, United Kingdom, France, and China. At that time, also India and Pakistan and North Korea was known to have possessed nuclear weapons, but Israel had never admitted, but it does have nuclear weapons. All Islamic states, with the exception of Pakistan, have ratified this nuclear non-proliferation Treaty of 1968, and Pakistan has on many occasions said that it will also sign it, provided that India will do the same. Then there is another outstanding treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapon, 2017. For the first time, legally, it made it binding that the prohibition, it's a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons and finally to eliminate it. All Islamic countries, well, most Islamic countries, including Algeria, Bangladesh, Brunei, Indonesia, Comoros, Libya, Malaysia, Maldives, Palestine, Sudan, they have signed this prohibition of nuclear weapon. For nuclear weapon states that wish to join this treaty, the total prohibition, it also has a framework, a time-bound framework that would eventually eliminate all nuclear weapons. I think that I have spoken what I wanted to say. If there are discussions, maybe we'll later have it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Dr. Hashim Kamali. It is indeed a very well presented keynote address. I think taking a position of Islam, and also in your presentation, you did also cover other faiths' stand on this nuclear weapon. And I think from the perspective of Maqasid Sharia, the objective of Sharia, I think none of these reasons behind this Maqasid or the higher objective of Sharia allow this nuclear weapon to take place. And I think you started with a very good, the beginning of your presentations on Islam, how it starts with Islam, that Islam promotes peace. And I think in one of the pillars of this requirement as a Muslims, when during our prayers, we end our prayers with salam, with peace on our right and on left. So in other words, Islam and all other religions do not condone these nuclear weapons. Thank you very much, Prof. Kamali. Okay, we will continue with the roundtable discussion, and I would like to invite all the presenters to join us. Okay. As we have mentioned earlier, the RTD this afternoon entitled The Role of Civil Societies and Faith-Based Organization in Global Nuclear Disarmament. And we have presenters from Magnus Lovold, from of the Policy Advisor, International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, based in Geneva. He will be discussing on the nuclear weapons, its threats, and the significance of TPNW. Followed by Mr. Hakim Hamzah, Secretary General of Malaysian Red Crescent Society, PBSM, where he will be sharing on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. Mr. Zahid Rastam, the Principal Assistant Secretary, Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, Multilateral Security Division, MSD, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, will be sharing us on Malaysia's plan towards global nuclear disarmament. And Ms. Aisya Abdul Rahman, the legal advisor to the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, which she will be sharing with us on the legal challenges after ratifications. That will be in the next 2 months. And we also will be having a discussant, Joanne Foo, Head of the Communication and Corporate Affairs of Soka Gakkai, will be having the discussion, as well as Tuan Haji Azmi Abdul Hamid, the President of the Malaysian Consultative Council Islamic Organization, MAPIM, that will share the discussion. So I would like to start with Mr. Magnus Lovold. Mr. Magnus, over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'm absolutely delighted to join you here from Geneva, a cold and early winter morning here in Geneva. I would like to thank IAIS and my colleagues in the ICRC for organizing today's event, and absolutely honored to join this panel of distinguished speakers. I will try to just get my PowerPoint presentation up. I hope that you can all see it in a minute. Let's see. Okay. I hope that you are all able to see these slides that I'm presenting. Wonderful. Thank you. I will give a brief presentation, as you mentioned, on the threat of nuclear weapons and the significance of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We'll speak for about 15 minutes. I'm very interested in hearing what the other panelists have to say, and of course also afterwards take any questions and comments from those in the audience. I was thinking of starting to tell a bit of a story based on actual events. On the 6th of August, 75 years ago, at exactly 8:15 in the morning, an entirely new weapon exploded over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Within a fraction of a second, a massive dome, a ball of fire, completely filled the sky. And at several thousand degrees Celsius, the intense heat of this explosion completely eclipsed the center of this city and immediately vaporizing all living things. A millisecond later, after this explosion, an extremely violent supersonic blast wave expanded outwards from the fireball in all directions, and leveled most of the city and its inhabitants to the ground. A few weeks later, a person called Fritz Bilfinger, who's a delegate of the International Committee of the Red Cross, arrived in Hiroshima to assess the damage. And the telegram that he sent back to his colleagues in Tokyo paints a really chilling picture. City wiped out, 80% all hospitals destroyed or seriously damaged, inspected 2 emergency hospitals, conditions beyond description, full stop. Effects of bomb mysteriously serious, stop. It would later emerge that the explosion had instantly killed tens of thousands of people and inflicted unspeakable suffering on many others. 3 days after the bombing of Hiroshima, on 9th of August 1945, this new weapon would again unleash its terrifying power, this time to kill and injure about 60% of the population of Nagasaki, another Japanese city. And in the following months and years, as noted by Biljana in her introduction, and despite really the best efforts of the ICRC and the Japanese Red Cross Society to assist the victims, tens of thousands more would die from the long-lasting effects of this explosion, including extensive cell damage caused by ionizing radiation. And disturbingly, the explosion has continued to kill up until this day, each year causing cancers and other deadly illnesses in those that found themselves near the explosion in 1945. The bombs that exploded in the early days of August 1945 were uniquely horrific and absolutely terrifying weapons of war. The unspeakable suffering and devastation that was witnessed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki led the ICRC to conclude almost immediately that these weapons, like other inhumane weapons, must never be used again and completely prohibited under international law. And in 1948, the entire International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement called for states to prohibit absolutely all recourse to such weapons and to the use of atomic energy or any similar force for purposes of warfare. Now, in the following decades, unfortunately, states did not heed this call. Instead, we saw that the number of nuclear weapons continued to grow. And 75 years after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there are still more than 13,000 nuclear weapons in the world, and thousands of these are on so-called hair trigger alert, meaning that they are ready to be launched at a moment's notice. We know that the use of even a fraction of these weapons would cause mass suffering and destruction over wide areas and on a really unimaginable scale. We know that even a limited use of nuclear weapons would have long-term, irreversible effects on human health, the environment, the climate, and food production. That is really on everything that life depends. This threatens future generations and the very survival of humanity. We also know that any use of nuclear weapons would generate a large-scale health emergency that we are really not equipped to deal with. From recent research by the ICRC and United Nations, we have learned that no government or international organization has the capacity to respond to the colossal humanitarian needs following a nuclear detonation. And then the question becomes, who will assist the victims of a nuclear explosion and how will they do it? And our inability to answer this really uncomfortable question makes it clear to us that prevention is really the only responsible course of action. What we cannot prepare for, we must prevent. So we know that any use of nuclear weapons would cause a humanitarian and global health crisis of unimaginable proportions. And yet the risk that nuclear weapons may be used again is frighteningly high, and it is increasing. Today, we are seeing a really disturbing shift from a focus on non-use and elimination to making the use of nuclear weapons possible or more likely. States are intensifying their efforts to develop faster, more mobile, in their view, more precise and more usable nuclear weapons capable of striking a greater variety of targets. At the same time, nuclear weapons are given an increasingly prevalent or important role in the security policies and military doctrines of these states. We also see that the legal and policy framework that regulates nuclear weapons is partially breaking down. The UN Secretary General, who's on the screen here, has warned recently that the Cold War is back, but with a difference. The mechanisms and safeguards to manage the risk of escalation that existed in the past no longer seem to be present. These developments contribute, obviously, to a further deterioration of an already hostile international security environment. And from our perspective, the introduction of nuclear weapons into regional conflicts and global rivalries will render such conflicts more dangerous and increase the risk of a global conflagration in which much of humanity may suffer irreparably. So let's look at how we're going to get out of this. The first step from our perspective in our efforts to prevent the use of nuclear weapons is to recognize these weapons for what they really are. That is, weapons of war with unacceptable humanitarian consequences. And for us, this is a fundamental point. Last year, the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Peter Maurer, he said that prohibiting and eliminating weapons with catastrophic humanitarian consequences should not be controversial. The unspeakable human suffering and unimaginable destruction caused by the use of nuclear weapons is the strongest argument for their prohibition and elimination. Last year, the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions, which is the foundational instruments of international humanitarian law, this anniversary provided a forceful reminder that even wars have limits. These limits include the IHL prohibitions on means and methods of warfare that have indiscriminate or disproportionate effects or are of a nature to cause excessive suffering. Under the principles of IHL, it is clear that military needs can never justify using inhumane or indiscriminate weapons, or weapons that are otherwise abhorrent to the principles of humanity and the dictates of public conscience. These were really the considerations that led the ICRC and the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement to conclude that it is indeed difficult to envisage how any use of nuclear weapons could be compatible with this body of law called IHL, and also led us to call in 2011 for their prohibition and elimination through a new legally binding international agreement. And throughout history, the international community has really taken decisive action to prohibit and eliminate weapons that have unacceptable humanitarian consequences. And in 2017, and as noted by some of the previous speakers, states responded to the evidence of the immense suffering of nuclear weapons by adopting the landmark Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Answering a call that really echoes through the decades, the treaty is, from our perspective, a long-awaited tool to ensure that nuclear weapons are never used again. Against the backdrop of a world in which the risk of use of nuclear weapons is increasing, the treaty reinforces the taboo against their use. Against claims that a world without nuclear weapons cannot be achieved, the treaty presents a roadmap for the elimination of nuclear weapons. And against claims that nuclear weapons are essential for national security, the treaty outlines a vision of collective security, one that is more viable, sustainable, and humane. And after the 50th instrument of ratification to this treaty was deposited with the UN Secretary General in October, we now know that the TPNW will enter into force as a new norm of international humanitarian law on the 22nd of January 2021. The imminent entry into force of this treaty is truly a historic achievement. As we celebrate this moment, the entry into force of the TPNW, we must, however, not forget that prohibiting nuclear weapons is the beginning and not the end of our efforts. There are, as I've mentioned, still more than 13,000 nuclear weapons in the world, and this is the reality that we are up against. The TPNW articulates the end state and benchmark against which all our efforts towards nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation must now be judged. It offers a crucial promise to current and future generations that one day we will be freed of the dark shadow of nuclear weapons. So as we look forward now to the first meeting of states parties of this treaty, we must ensure that the treaty's provisions are faithfully implemented. We must also, and this is crucial, really intensify and scale up our efforts to achieve the treaty's broadest possible adherence. And finally, coming back to where we started, in all our efforts, we must strive to keep the testimonies of the Hibakusha, the survivors of the atomic bombings, and the evidence of the catastrophic humanitarian consequences at the very center of this debate. This treaty first became possible when the nuclear weapons debate shifted from focusing on the possessor of these weapons and their motives to the weapon itself and the profound humanitarian impact that these weapons have. And by maintaining this focus, we believe that we can take this treaty all the way to its end goal, which is a world without nuclear weapons. I will end there. I would like to thank you so very much for your attention. Looking forward to hearing what the other distinguished panelists have to say, and of course also happy to take any questions and comments in the Q&A afterward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Magnus, all the way from Geneva. And I think, the rest, the participants, please bear, your questions afterwards. After all the presenters completed their presentation, we will open that Q&A. We now continue with the second presenters, Mr. Hakim Hamzah, who will be discussing on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. Over to you, Mr. Hakim.
Thank you, Associate Professor Dr. Muhammad Azam, Muhammad Adil, our moderator. Let me see if I can share my screen. Yep. Okay. Assalamualaikum and very good afternoon to everyone. It is my pleasure to share our views on what the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons would bring. In the international humanitarian law perspective, as recorded by the International Court of Justice, it was quoted that the threat or use of nuclear weapons would generally be contrary to the rules of international law, applicable in armed conflicts and, in particular, the principles and rules of humanitarian law. There was a vote in the court's decision on this matter, and it was 7 votes to 7, with the president casting the deciding vote. So that was how intense the thoughts were on the use of nuclear weapons. And from the humanitarian perspective or humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, we feel that the consequences for mankind and the environment would be too devastating, and we do not know if we can cope with the consequences of the use of nuclear weapons. So during the first international conference of the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, it was concluded that the humanitarian consequences would put our ability to offer assistance in question, as the impact of the detonations would be too devastating. And among the main outcomes of the conference were that there's no state or international body would be able to adequately address the humanitarian emergency as a consequence of nuclear weapon detonation. Due to the characteristics of the nuclear weapon, it may not be possible to develop any capability to address the humanitarian emergency of this kind. So then there was the second conference of the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. Among the main conclusions was that the detonation of nuclear weapons would not be restricted to any national borders. It would transcend national borders, and the risk of nuclear weapons is growing as a result of proliferation, the vulnerability of nuclear command and control networks to cyber attacks, and to human errors, as the potential access to nuclear weapons exists by non-state actors. So we need to take into account that in the past, weapons have been eliminated and outlawed. However, in our view, this is consistent with the obligations under the international law, including those derived from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, as well as the Common Article of the Geneva Conventions. So nuclear weapons, what are they? So nuclear weapons have the ability to cause a serious or immediate long-term consequences for people, society, and the environment. This has been clearly depicted in the video at the beginning of our session. And the full extent of these consequences depends very much on the size or the number or height or location of the explosion. Therefore, we can only make general predictions on the actual impact of this explosion. The detonation of nuclear weapon releases a large amount of energy, as explained in the video earlier. 50% of the energy will come in the form of the blast. 35% shall be from the heat itself. So there we have seen that the various phases of destruction the nuclear weapon would bring to humanity. And the remaining 50% will come in the form of radiation, of which 5% are the initial ionizing of the radiation, and the remaining 10% would be the residual nuclear radiation. So together, it would cause a tremendous amount of physical destruction to humanity. So in terms of world nuclear forces, as of January 2012, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute estimated that there are around 19,000 warheads. That was 8 years ago. So to date, I'm confident that there are more. Some 4,400 are in operation, whilst the remainder are in either active or inactive or scheduled for dismantlement. So at all times, nearly 2,000 warheads are kept on high alert and are capable of being launched within minutes or hours. The immediate humanitarian consequences are serious and immediate. There are serious and immediate consequences, and the consequences depend very much on the size and location of the detonation, of which tens, even hundreds of thousands of people could be killed or seriously injured. So the blast would flatten buildings and instantaneously kill people within a large area. The heat and fire, the fireball that was illustrated in the video at the beginning of this session would reach several million degrees of Celsius, as no one around on ground zero would be able to survive the heat. Depending on the size of the explosion itself, the flash of the heat would produce radiation and cause severe burns and flash blindness as far as 20 kilometers from ground zero. On the radiation, they exposed to a large external doses of X-rays, gamma rays, and neutrons would be lethal, with death occurring within days and weeks. In the immediate term, the radiation exposure would cause suppression of the immune system and reduce resistance to infection. This would lead to destruction of the bone marrow, cardiovascular, and damage of the central nervous system. The psychosocial impact of nuclear weapon detonation, as we can see, the lasting legacy of the nuclear attack in Nagasaki was a higher rate of residents was suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, in the area close to ground zero. The damage to infrastructure, serious damage to critical infrastructure, would further worsen humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapon detonation. It's clear that those affected would not be able to leave hospitals ever in their life. Hospital buildings are also damaged and would be completely unusable, and damage to road system, electrical grid, communication networks, contamination of water supply would certainly take place. Medical personnel would be among the victims, and they are not only injured but not be able to return to work and assist those affected by the radiation. The long-term humanitarian consequences of the nuclear weapons, there would be a threat to food safety, as areas detonated by nuclear weapon would be jeopardized. Would not only jeopardize the local, but it would also jeopardize global food supply. Radioactive fallout would result in large areas of that would be unsuitable for food production for long periods of time, and the radioactive effect would not be just on one single country, but several countries, or may even be in the regions. Some countries need to import food from abroad. Therefore, this would result in the rise in of global food prices, and those the poor would certainly be the ones most affected. On economic destruction, it would be difficult to commence modern or commercial activities as most infrastructure would be destroyed. The resumption of activities would be very slow and expensive. And as we can see today, after 34 years of the Chernobyl nuclear plant explosion in 1986, the affected areas are still experiencing a high level of poverty as compared to neighboring regions like Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. The environmental damage of the detonation of nuclear weapon will result in widespread radioactive contamination, which in turn would render many sources of food and water supply useless. In such a situation, any cleanup process would be very expensive, sometimes even not even feasible. There is an overwhelming need for as mentioned by the ICRC, no organization on its own would be able to have sufficient resources to ensure an effective response to such a humanitarian crisis, therefore necessitating cooperation among multiple actors. Providing adequate, timely and appropriate assistance to thousands or even millions of people would require an enormous amount of manpower, material and resources. Such cooperation is certainly complicated by the lack of common understanding and what would be needed to address the humanitarian crisis. In terms of the assistance or to the response that is required for this, to the impact of the explosion of nuclear weapons or the detonation of nuclear weapons, for example, and in Malaysia, MRCS is providing the ambulance service. In those areas that are affected by the detonation, humanitarian assistance would certainly be difficult, as we would also be concerned the exposure of the radiation to our medical personnel as they move into to provide assistance or medical care or evacuation of those who are in need of further treatment. The provision of first aid or interventions by qualified medical personnel would be certainly difficult, as the severity of injuries would be beyond effective medical treatment. Survivors would also need to have access to shelter. However, the ionizing radiation impact would render this effort difficult or almost impossible. The additional capacities is required to provide humanitarian assistance. This would include the supply of uncontaminated water, food, shelter, and clothes. However, we also need to manage those who are fleeing from the area and those who may already be contaminated by the radiation. We would need to also consider the requirement to recover, identify, storing, and disposing of dead bodies that are affected by the nuclear weapon detonation. The scale of the destruction and the large number of those affected in densely populated areas such as Kuala Lumpur or other major cities would render a big challenge for us to provide the necessary needs to assist those who require assistance or to allocate available resources to provide assistance. For example, in the operation of providing medical assistance, we would need to plan for the triage and the treatment of large numbers of severely injured victims and the possible need for decontaminated and transfer interact. The human resources needed to manage the patient flow will be considerable and would rapidly exhaust the available resources available, the available response capacities. Furthermore, access to some areas would be almost impossible owing to debris and damage to infrastructure, and this would make it difficult to bring personnel and supplies to the assistance of survivors. One of the main safety concerns to the first responders would be the risk associated with exposure to the ionizing of the radiation. Therefore, appropriate protective measures need to be taken based on the principles of radiation protection and adapted to the specific circumstances of the operation. The first responders would need to be able to effectively deliver humanitarian assistance, although they need to understand that these areas may have risks and characteristics and effects of ionizing the radiation may provide an adverse impact on our personnel. This will imply that immediate humanitarian assistance provided is influenced very much on the actual exposure and the contamination level in the specified area, hence rendering some areas to be possibly off limits or not accessible by responders for a considerable period of time. Such restrictions is applicable if the respondents are inclined to accept the risk to their health in view of the enormous needs. Additionally, working in such circumstances would certainly be a heavy toll on the psychological well-being of not only the responders as well as those who are close to the victims. There is an extreme there will be an extreme logistical challenges in order to provide the relevant assistance. Humanitarian organizations would need to be present on ground immediately after the detonation of the nuclear weapon. However, then dangerous radiation would preclude this, as these organizations may have to balance between the requirements of the humanitarian mission and the risk of exposing their own personnel. The deployment of external resources would require or would be dependable on transport, the availability of transport and other logistic capabilities. This would be forthcoming in the event of a nuclear weapon detonation, and which would be an open question. The next question would also be whether states would allow passage for military assets intended for assistance purposes. The availability of personnel to provide humanitarian assistance due to the complexity and magnitude of this the explosion, the national emergency response capacities would certainly be overwhelmed, and there would need to be an effective collaboration amongst assistance providers. So to conclude, I have to say that if a nuclear weapon were to be detonated in Malaysia, it will be impossible for our first responders to provide the humanitarian assistance necessary, and this would be one of the main reasons as to why nuclear weapons should be banned altogether. It is also for this reason that as a Malaysian, I am very proud that Malaysia was the 46th country to ratify the treaty. With that, I thank you and am open to questions later. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hakim Hamzah. You just talked about the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. So we reserve the questions, and now we would like to invite Zahid Rastam, who will be sharing with us on the Malaysians' plan towards global nuclear disarmament. Over to you, Mr. Zahid.
Thank you very much. Let me just get my shared screen on. Are you able to see my shared screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Professor Dato Dr. Hashim Kamali, Professor Dr. Mohammad Azam, Ms. Milosevic, fellow members of the panel, friends and colleagues. Thank you, first of all, to IAIS, ICRC, and the MRCS for organizing this event. For the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the role of civil society is very important. And in particular, the role of faith-based organizations have a special role and ability to promote nuclear discourse on nuclear disarmament, as what was mentioned by Professor Kamali in his keynote much earlier. Essentially, all faiths have peace as a central tenet of their belief. And for the Foreign Ministry, we believe that the role that civil society can play is quite essential. The role of nuclear weapons and the fact that they can have such a devastating potential for creating a catastrophic humanitarian consequences goes against, I believe, the whole concept and foundation of what peace is. I have been asked to talk about sort of the Malaysian government's plans or the vision and mission towards global disarmament. And I have to emphasize here that this is necessary a joint effort. It's a global effort. It requires countries to work with various actors, domestically and internationally. It means different parts of government working together with civil society. It means one state working with another at the international level or at the regional level. And it requires very much that there is a partnership between civil society and government, whether that is domestically based or domestically focused, or whether that has a larger international scope. And the reason why we say this is because nuclear weapons, they exist and they have become so indoctrinated into the systems of some of those countries that view nuclear weapons as being essential to their security or to the collective securities, including countries such as Malaysia, which is a non-nuclear weapons state, which is against nuclear weapons. But others, those that have those weapons, need to ensure that they do their best, and they need to fulfill the commitments and the legal obligations to get rid of those weapons. So the scope of what I will be talking about today, it's a bit different slightly from what was stated in the title of this session, but essentially I will speak a bit about Malaysia and nuclear disarmament. I will talk about nuclear disarmament in 2020 and 2021, and the reason why I will do so is because due to the COVID-19 pandemic, quite a few sort of milestones in terms of nuclear disarmament at the international level have been delayed. We've had some good things, such as the TPNW that got its 50th ratification a few weeks ago, but it will come into force in 2021. The NPT review conference that should have taken place in 2020 is also going to take place in 2021. And there are a number of other different things going on. So it's important that we look at this in terms of how, for us, the foreign ministry can strategize and approach those things, but also in terms of how we can work together with civil society. I'll speak a bit about the background of the NPT and TPNW. I won't go into too much detail as there have been introductions by the speakers before me. But just some of the things that I will speak about, I think, will help to assist in terms of the context of what countries need to do in the coming year or so. I will speak about the current situation in the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime. And this is, I think, essential to understand that there is this wider picture and efforts going on in terms of nuclear disarmament and how that impacts what countries are doing and how it impacts the behavior of certain states in terms of nuclear disarmament. And I will talk a bit about a few of the efforts undertaken by my foreign ministry and some proposals in terms of how we can move forward on that. Now, for Malaysia, we have always had a strong principled position on nuclear disarmament. Essentially, that is the total elimination of nuclear weapons. Now, we are party to a number of international instruments. We are party to the NPT. We are party to the Southeast Asia Nuclear Weapons Free Zone Treaty. We are party to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So although this treaty itself is technically not in force, but we are a state party to it. And then we are now a state party to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which will enter into force in January of next year. Just to highlight that one of the things that makes it easier for Malaysia to become party to these different instruments is that for a country like Malaysia, when we became party to the NPT, we had agreed to not acquire or possess any nuclear weapons. We agreed not to transfer, to control such weapons, and so on. That's why we're non-nuclear weapons state. When we became party to the SHOMFES later on, SHOMFES also has various articles that prohibit things such as the developing, testing, manufacture, or otherwise acquire, possess. So similar sort of prohibitions within the NPT and the SHOMFES. And then you have the TPNW, which is, we would say, the more comprehensive one because it looks at the whole range of activities related to nuclear weapons and prohibits those activities. So it includes all those that I mentioned before, develop, test, manufacture, produce, acquire, but then also things such as transfer to another recipient, having control, receiving the transfer, use and threat of use, which is very significant because it puts on the international law that the use or threat of use is something that is illegal, assist, and so on. So for a country like Malaysia, our ratification of the TPNW is very much in line with the existing positions and principal positions that we have always had to include disarmament. So legally for us, this is something that was essential and it reinforces our own commitments and obligations. But it is at the international level where I think this is significant in terms of what it creates for international law. Now, the next part in terms of nuclear disarmament in 2020 and 2021. In 2020, so the year that we are still currently on, we're all aware that it's been 75 years since atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, since the first use of such weapons, and we hope the only time and the last time they'd ever be used, 75 years of the United Nations. And the NPT itself, it reached its 50th anniversary of its entry into force in March of this year, and the 25th anniversary of its indefinite extension. As part of the work with regard to the to the 50th entry into force, Malaysia and a number of other countries had in fact back in May of this year initiated a joint communique that included countries such as Algeria, Austria, Brazil, Chile, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Egypt, Indonesia, Ireland, Malaysia itself, Mexico, Morocco, New Zealand, Nigeria, Philippines, South Africa, and Thailand. And basically, we commemorated the historic and landmark year of 2020 for the 50th anniversary of the NPT, and to emphasize the important need to progress to be made within the NPT context. And this was something that despite the various sort of restrictions, especially in May of this year with regard to COVID, but this is something that our diplomats and negotiated with their colleagues in New York, and it was issued to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the NPT. Now, the NPT itself, just allow me to speak a little about background here. I think many of those attending are very familiar, but it is a treaty with a number of objectives. It is essentially a treaty to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and weapons technology. This is the sort of non-proliferation pillar of it. It is then to promote cooperation with peaceful use, the peaceful use pillar, and to achieve nuclear disarmament, the disarmament pillar. And it is in the disarmament side of things where things have been lacking the most in terms of progress. There have been commitments made in the past, but the implementation of those commitments is something that remains to be desired. The third point there is what I wish to emphasize. The 2020 review conference has been postponed to 2021. The dates are being worked on by the state parties with the secretary, and we'll have, I believe, confirmation or a better indication of when those dates are as we progress into 2021 and in terms of global efforts towards the pandemic, in terms of whether or not and how the review conference would be convened. Our ambassador, our permanent representative in New York, Dato Mohammad Hussein, he will be chairing Main Committee 1 on nuclear disarmament during this review conference. There are 3 main committees, and there's a president who is overall in charge. The main committees, one is on disarmament, one is on non-proliferation, and one is on peaceful use. And Malaysia will be chairing the one related to disarmament. And I will speak more on that later on in my presentation. For the TPNW, at present, there are 84 signatories and 50 state parties. It was mentioned that Malaysia had ratified on 30th September this year. We were number 46. And then Tuvalu, Jamaica, Nauru, and Honduras. And with Honduras's ratification, that allowed for the treaty to come into force 90 days after the 50th ratification. And that entry into force will come in on 22nd January of this coming year. We all know that the TPNW was open for signature back in 2017. And for Malaysia, we had played a role in the negotiation of and processes leading to the treaty. The importance of the TPNW, as emphasized before, is that it seeks to prohibit the whole range of activities related to nuclear weapons. So developing, testing, producing, manufacturing, transferring, possessing, and so on. As mentioned before, if you look at the other treaties, and Shomfez combined this in terms of the prohibitions, but the TPNW is more comprehensive. So we see that all as being part of a framework that is comprehensive, that looks at the whole range of activities, and this is one of the strengths of TPNW. It does not leave anything out. State parties to the TPNW are also prohibited from assisting, encouraging, or inducing anyone to engage in any one of those activities. Another important prohibition. TPNW, state parties must also not allow nuclear weapons to be stationed or deployed on the territory. This is similar for Malaysia as what we have in Shomfez. But it is the second point here, and I mentioned this before, on the prohibition on threatening the use of nuclear weapons is the first time in international law, in hard international law, that the threat of use is declared illegal. It was mentioned before with regard to the ICJ advisory opinion in 1996, but the use or the legality of the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons. And indeed, the ICJ did come up with a 7-7 decision, but in a sense, it was somewhat inconclusive about whether use or threat of use was totally illegal. It did say that depending on circumstances, if a country threatened, then perhaps it could use it, and so on. But they were looking at it from perhaps a point of view related to the general threat of armed conflict and the use of threat in armed conflict, and not so much from the humanitarian consequence perspective related to the use of nuclear weapons. So by having this threat of use declared illegal or prohibited under the treaty, and the treaty coming into force, then it makes it under international law something that is illegal, and we think that this is quite significant. Another important aspect about the TPNW is that the NPT, as compared to the NPT, is that the NPT allows for a number of states to have nuclear weapons and for their recognition as nuclear weapon states, but it prohibits it for others. TPNW, on the other hand, does not make such distinctions. All nuclear weapons are prohibited, and this is something that we believe is quite important, as stated earlier, that it is the very existence of nuclear weapons which is the threat. Now, the current situation in the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime, I think it was mentioned by the other speakers before me, but let me just add to the voice in terms of how it is important for us to look at this, and more so from the point of view of the foreign ministry. We look at it from a perspective of government actions, government discussions, and being able to strategize and decide in terms of how we want to move forward on this. So for sure, the ABM treaty and the INF treaty, those are gone. The renewal of the New START treaty, that remains uncertain. The US has made a number of pronouncements to state that they are willing to renew negotiations and start, but they have put some conditions on that. and Russia has their own views on some of those conditions. China has some views on some of those conditions, as to whether or not it will be renewed with a different administration in the US than that one that is current. That remains to be seen. Whether there is a significant change in that position, because there hasn't been any formal pronouncements by either side. But also at the same time, there's an issue of time, because whoever takes the oath of office as the US president on the 20th of January next year, they would only have about 16 days or so to get it approved and ratified. So it is something that still remains uncertain. And if the New START does not come about, then you have one less instrument, or you have the last instrument with regard to nuclear arms control between the two major superpowers that will be gone. And that would create a very high risk, because it takes away the ability of states to have confidence in terms of the threat perception of the other state. In the second point, many of the intergovernmental processes have devolved. The tensions have led to situations where there have been acrimony, there is a lack of diplomacy, and there's unwillingness to cooperate and seek solutions. Diplomacy and foreign relations is about talking with each other. It's about building trust and confidence. And if states can't do that, if the diplomats are bickering and arguing all the time, then that creates a more difficult and dangerous situation. And in fact, with some of the bigger countries, due to geostrategic tensions and a whole range of other issues when it comes to nuclear disarmament, that has become very difficult as well. This affects the NPT review conference prospects of an outcome. Malaysia, as mentioned, we will be chairing one of those meeting committees, so we will do our best, and we will put in our utmost effort. But we do know that that is a difficult process, and this is something that not only us, but all the other countries that are state parties to the NPT know that this is something that will be quite challenging. One of the main issues which I seek to emphasize is that some of the nuclear weapon states, and also not just the states themselves, but many of the countries that are aligned to them, particularly if they're in security or a nuclear deterrent sort of relationship, are unwilling to reaffirm past commitments towards nuclear disarmament, let alone to make any new ones. Part of it is a lack of leadership, as some of the major powers with the most weapons have not committed to serious steps towards nuclear disarmament. So if a country cannot reaffirm what they said they were going to do, and if they don't implement what they said they're going to do, that is a very sad state of situations, because it means that the trust and confidence that you need from countries putting their name down and committing themselves to whatever commitments they make, if that is not being followed up, then that suggests that the other commitments perhaps are something that they may not follow as well. Some of the concerns that we do have with the current situation in nuclear disarmament, and this was mentioned, I believe, by other speakers as well, there is slow progress in the reduction of strategic or non-strategic nuclear weapons. And in fact, I think, at least in the past few years, that reduction hasn't really happened. There was slow progress throughout the 90s. There was a period right after the Cold War where a huge number of warheads were taken offline. And also delivery systems. You had some more back in the early 2000s with the various treaties there. You had some more with the New START, but in the past few years, this reduction has been very slow. There is the continued dependence on nuclear weapons in strategic and security policies and doctrines. If a country still believes, and it does state that nuclear weapons is essential for its security, then it's a lot more difficult to persuade them to get rid of it. But it doesn't mean we can't, but it means that it's something that we have to persist and persevere. They continue to modernize and upgrade their nuclear arsenals, especially with the technology that exists. We're looking at situations where, based on the pronouncements by the major superpowers, that some of the weapons they have are weapons which they intend to keep and maintain up until 2070, 2080, 2090, especially about big ticket items such as ICBMs or the submarines and the submarine launched ballistic missiles, because these are major investments. Technology exists to make these things operational for a much longer period of time. So if a country is going to invest billions and billions and perhaps trillions in some cases of their own treasure for keeping a nuclear arsenal, it becomes even more challenging to persuade them that that is not the sort of investment they should be making. There is a lack of transparency. There is a high alert status. I think Magnus touched upon that earlier. This is something where, if you want to lower tensions, you have to lower the ability of people to strike. You have to give them time to be able to react in case of an unintentional or accidental use. There is the continuing pursuit of nuclear weapons programs, and that's something that needs to be looked at. But there's also this insistence of some countries to remain outside of the NPT, and there are many countries who want to be outside of the TPNW regime. And here, I would just like to add to some of the points that were made earlier about the importance of the TPNW. I'm sure many who have followed this issue have heard that the nuclear weapon states have boycotted the TPNW process. They have said many things which are very derogatory or even unkind towards the treaty is, but also made some proper comments about what they think. For Malaysia, we view the TPNW as constituting an effective legal measure under Article 6 of the NPT. NPT says that nuclear weapon states have to engage in good faith negotiations leading towards nuclear disarmament. TPNW does that because it is legally sound, it is feasible to implement, and it has a pathways built within it in some of its articles about how countries with nuclear weapons or how countries which host nuclear weapons can be able to get rid of those weapons and get into a process of verification to ensure that denuclearization is full and irreversible. Some of these same countries have argued that they are opposed to the TPNW and they feel that it disturbs the NPT framework. We very much disagree with this viewpoint. We see it as complementary. But there is something important here, is that the TPNW does exist, it will come into force, and it cannot be ignored. So what is needed is to find a balanced way to reflect and to conceptually understand in terms of the state to state and also the civil society discourse, that there is a need to balance and to reflect the TPNW and its relationship with the NPT for many states. At the same time, we have to recognize what some of the reservations that other countries have towards the TPNW. And we need to understand or recognize those reservations, not as an excuse, but we need to recognize those reservations so that we can be able to better engage them and better deal with them in terms of persuading them that they need to get rid of those weapons. So we feel for the TPNW, the expected entry into force of the treaty would build momentum and pressure the nuclear weapon states to further undertake disarmament measures. But we are realistic, however, because too strong a push may create a flowback. And in fact, just before Honduras put forward its ratification in New York a couple of weeks ago, one of the nuclear weapon states circulated a letter to countries saying you should not ratify it, and if you have ratified it, you should consider withdrawing. This is part and parcel of foreign policy and international diplomacy. It happens, but it shows again that there are countries out there who feel strongly, and we shouldn't back down just as much as they won't back down. But we do need to engage and to discuss with each other, and to get them to understand that it's important to support it. We do believe that when we move forward in terms of TPNW entry force, this will give direction for further initiatives aimed at elimination of nuclear weapons, because the TPNW gives another platform for non-nuclear weapon states to work together in a format that is equal, in a format where all countries are equal, which we think is quite important because the TPNW does not make distinctions between different levels of states. So this strengthens the global norm against nuclear weapons. It is inclusive, and it is something that we feel is important. I'm just have a few more slides. One thing that I would like to mention is that in terms of efforts by Wisma Putra, as we look forward to 2021 for NPT, there are two things here. We have in our national capacity Malaysia. At the same time, Malaysia is chairing Main Committee 1. So how this usually works is that our ambassador, Dato Zahid Rastam, he chairs Main Committee 1, so he has to be a chairman who is neutral and balanced. At the same time, you have the Malaysian delegation, and the Malaysian delegation will push forward Malaysia's positions. This is just something that takes place in diplomacy when you have these situations. But I'd just like to point out that in our national capacity as Malaysia, what we would look for at the 2020 MPT REFCON taking place in 2021 is to seek reaffirmation and implementation of past commitments and to get concrete commitments towards nuclear disarmament. In our capacity as chair of Main Committee 1, that is to facilitate an outcome that is by consensus, that is balanced, but consensus and balance doesn't mean that we cannot be ambitious. So we do want for the state parties to work well with each other so that we can come something that's good and that's something that can do proper service to the issue of nuclear disarmament. Now for the TPNW, 30 days after its entry into force, so 30 days after 22nd January of 2021, state parties need to submit a declaration to the UNSG in terms of whether or not they have nuclear weapons and whether they're engaged in any of the prohibited activities. So this is something that is a task by the government, and the Foreign Ministry will be working and coordinating with the relevant ministries and agencies within government to ensure that we can be able to submit this declaration. For the TPNW as well, the meeting of state parties needs to take place within 1 year of the entry into force. And this is something that we will be discussing further with other state parties to the TPNW in terms of how to ensure a successful meeting of state parties and what we want to do in that meeting of state parties. As per the treaty itself in Article 8 of TPNW, it states that the purpose of the meeting of state parties is to implement, is to look at further measures and to review the sort of the implementation and status of the treaty, and to look at measures for the verified, time-bound, and irreversible elimination of nuclear weapons programs. The verified, time-bound, and unreversible, I think this would perhaps require a bit more time in terms of discussion, but looking at sort of new steps or ambitions that the TPNW countries can do, I think is quite important. So in this, I would just like to add that for Malaysia, we will work with other state parties on developing the TPNW framework further and how to utilize it and how to make sure that it is effective and efficient to pursue nuclear disarmament. And of course, we need to engage with non-TPNW states. We will also, on our own, but collectively with others, also encourage other countries to become party to the TPNW as soon as possible. We need to ensure that there remains strong global political will towards nuclear disarmament. As mentioned earlier, the TPNW entry into force is just a beginning. It is not an end. There are still many other signatories that need to ratify. There are still many other countries that need to exceed, and there are still many other countries that need to be persuaded on the importance and significance of this TPNW. But we will do that working not just with states, but also with civil society on promoting nuclear disarmament awareness, education, and discourse in particular on the TPNW. And with that, I would like to thank you for your time and your patience, and thank you very much to the organizers.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Zahid Rastam, on the Bismarck Putra's point on this Malaysia's plan towards global nuclear disarmament, especially on the perspective of this TPNW when it takes effective in January 2021. We move to the last presenters, Ms. Aisya Abdul Rahman, on the legal challenges after ratification. Ms. Aisya, please.
Thank you, Associate Professor. Assalamualaikum and a very good afternoon, everyone. So to recap today, there are now more than 13,000 nuclear weapons around the world, and these weapons are more powerful than the ones that detonated in Hiroshima and Nagasaki 75 years ago. Now, 75 years later, today, Japan Red Cross hospitals are still treating the hibakushas, the survivors of the bombing. Now, this will be the first thing that I would recommend. This is the first thing that CSO, civil society, can do. Spread this message, not just about the devastation of the nuclear weapons, the devastating impacts of nuclear weapons once it's detonated, but also spread the message on the increasing nuclear threat, the urgency of the situation, as well as the total lack of preparedness that nobody, no state, no body, especially working by themselves, could be able to respond to if a nuclear weapon, such a bombing that happened 75 years ago, were to happen again today. Now, to demonstrate this urgency, the urgency of the situation, I would have another video to show you guys, and we will see how urgent actually the situation is.
Excuse me, Miss Aisha, we can't hear. There's no volume in the video.
There's no video.
There's no audio.
Yeah.
To a false warning of an impending attack, or even worse, access the launch codes. The official line is that having nuclear weapons keeps us safe, yet the reverse is true. As long as nuclear weapons exist, there is a risk they can be used. All states must join the Nuclear Ban Treaty now and bring the nuclear weapons era to an end.
Okay. I understand that there was an audio issue. Should we play the video again?
Yes, please.
Okay, sure. Excuse me, sorry.
There are almost 14,000 nuclear bombs in the world, thousands of which are ready to be used in an instant. Most are far more powerful than those that devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Since then, nuclear weapons have almost been used many times because of malfunctions, mishaps, false alarms, and misunderstandings. In 1995, for example, a research rocket launched to study the Northern Lights was mistaken for a nuclear missile and led the world to the brink of destruction. We know a nuclear explosion would lead to a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. Yet the risk that nuclear weapons are used is higher today than it has been in decades. Military incidences involving nuclear states and their allies are happening more and more often, and states are making explicit threats to use nuclear weapons. Agreements to eliminate existing arsenals are being abandoned as new nuclear weapons are being developed. We are on a dangerous path towards a new nuclear arms race. At the same time, digital technologies that now control nuclear weapons could be hacked to issue a false warning of an impending attack, or even worse, access the launch codes. The official line is that having nuclear weapons keeps us safe, yet the reverse is true. As long as nuclear weapons exist, there is a risk they can be used. All states must join the Nuclear Ban Treaty now and bring the nuclear weapons era to an end.
Okay, you should continue.
So, yes, thank you, Associate Professor. And I will share I'll share also my presentation.
You just close the video. I think that's it.
Yes, I have one. Okay.
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 Okay, we can see the PowerPoint now. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So basically, it's not okay. I'll just present it as it is. So just now I mentioned the first thing that that CSOs could do, which is basically to spread the message, to mobilize, to disseminate, to spread the message on the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons, as previous colleagues have established today, highlight the increasing risk of nuclear threats, and also the unpreparedness and the urgency of the situation. Now, there are two other things that I would also recommend. One for NGOs and NGOs as well as faith-based organizations, and another for academics, think tanks, as well as professional bodies. Now, the second thing that that NGOs and FBOs could assist is basically, firstly, to coordinate the responses, when in the event of nuclear attack. Now, of course, we would not wish that we would even want this to happen, but in the event that it occurs again, we will need to be prepared. And in that sense, we've seen recently, for example, when it comes to COVID-19 in Malaysia, how one could argue that the responses are fragmented, and therefore FBOs, therefore NGOs could assist medical professionals, public healthcare assistants to deliver age-sensitive, gender-sensitive, child-sensitive responses. And we've heard also very recently, how many times have we heard that some people in Malaysia at least receive too much aid, while others still fall through the cracks and have not received such aid. So this would be the first challenge, I would say, in terms of, this would be the first challenge that we could all band together, and civil society could do their part in coordinating responses. And what I mean here by responses, when it comes in situation of detonation of nuclear weapons, whether it's nuclear weapons testing or whether it's a nuclear attack, would cover everything from medical assistance, psychosocial support, socio-economic inclusion. Just now, Haji Hakim mentioned the fact that how the use and testing of nuclear weapons would be a threat to food safety, would result in water contamination. And explosions, of course, inevitably will cause destruction to infrastructure. And therefore, that would mean housing, and also the environment, our natural environment. And again, as TPNW also provide, thank you, Adli. TPNW also provide for environmental remediation as well. And this is some of the ways that NGOs and everyone could assist government actors. Um, government actors. The next, so another challenge, again, like I said, would also be to raise public awareness on the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons, as well as raise urgency of nuclear threats. The third thing that academics, think tanks, and professional bodies, this group of civil society actors could do is basically assist government in the implementation of TPNW. What happens when TPNW enters into force is that our obligations, international obligations of Malaysia need to be reflected in the legal and domestic law and domestic policy regimes. However, the fact of the matter is we still have there's still quite a bit of fragmentation across the different legal and policy regimes in relation to human rights, is particularly protection of the right to life and personal liberty. There are also we also have a legal regime in legal and policy regime in relation to nuclear energy, use of nuclear technology for peaceful purposes. There's also policy regimes on legal and policy regimes on environmental protection, as well as arms trade. Now, all these different regimes need to be streamlined, and how academics, think tanks, and professional bodies could assist is basically making sure that these different legal and policy regimes are streamlined through collection of data, conducting transversal studies across disciplines, whether it's across the multiple disciplines that they are involved, whether we're talking about the scientific and technology, science and technology, whether it's in relation to law and law enforcement, whether it's in relation to also delivery of humanitarian aid. By the end of the day, the aim is to have, if we were going to implement the TPNW once it enters into force come January, we will need to have a framework to implement the TPNW that is robust as well as inclusive. Now, in all this, how ICRC could assist is in terms of, one, as is provided in TPNW itself, is in the provision of victims assistance, together with IFRC, the International Federation of Crescent and Red Cross Societies, as well as MRCS, the Malaysian Red Crescent Society in Malaysia. Another way that ICRC could support civil society is through the ICRC IHL Advisory Service. We could assist state actors as well as civil society actors by way of the model law in implementing TPNW, as well as confidential and bilateral legal and policy guidance on TPNW. So there you have it. Those are my three. So those are the three things that I hope civil society could assist states, the government, the Malaysian government, in terms of implementing TPNW once it enters into force on Monday. I'd like to thank IAIS again, and also the audience. for your patience, as well as for your attention. I look forward to questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Miss Aisya. And I think apologies for the technical difficulties faced by Aisya over there. I think we will, perhaps if there are questions pertaining to her presentation, we will take up the question later. Okay, we would like to have the two discussants patiently waiting for their turns. Perhaps we can start with Joanne Foo. What do you think about this possible initiative towards global nuclear disarmament? Joanne, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, Professor Muhammad Azam. So first of all, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank the organizers, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the International Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies, and the Malaysian Red Crescent for organizing this very meaningful meeting and for giving me this opportunity to speak on behalf of the members of Soka Gakkai Malaysia. So it's my pleasure to join all of you here today to share a little bit about what Soka Gakkai has been doing to spread awareness, and in promoting nuclear disarmament. So most people, however, will feel intimidated, by this topic. Many would ask us, how does this relate to my life? So this is something which is very far removed from the day-to-day life of many people. Some may feel that this issue can only be dealt with by certain groups of people and that there is nothing the rest of us can do. So, but before I go further, just a very brief introduction on SGM. So Soka Gakkai Malaysia is a Buddhist organization that promotes peace, culture, and education centered on the respect for the dignity of life. So from a Buddhist perspective, we view nuclear weapons as an absolute evil. They go against our core belief in the sanctity of all life. So in fact, the name Soka, Soka Gakkai, the name Soka means value creation. And nuclear weapons, war, on the other hand, which destroys everything in its path, are of the greatest anti-value. So we also believe that life possesses the positive as well as the negative aspects. And the very existence of nuclear weapons is the manifestation of the darkest aspect of life. And this was what the second president of Soka Gakkai, Mr. Jose Toda, underscored in a declaration that he made way back in September 1957 in front of thousands of young people. And that declaration actually has become the cornerstone for Soka Gakkai's peace and disarmament activities. So can I share screen? So this is the declaration, a portion of what he said. Although a movement calling for a ban on the testing of atomic or nuclear weapons has arisen around the world, it is my wish to go further to attack the problem at its root. I want to expose and rip out the claws that lie hidden in the very depths of such weapons. So Mr. Toda believed that on a deep level, the struggle is not just about about the weapons, the nuclear weapons per se, but it's about the destructive aspect of human nature that seeks to destroy others. And I learned that this dark aspect of life that manifests as nuclear weapons also exists inside my life. And precisely because of that, this issue is related to your life, to all of our lives. So building on Mr. Toda's point, the current Soka Gakkai International President, Mr. Daisaku Ikeda, says, if we are to put the era of nuclear terror behind us, we must struggle against the real enemy. That enemy is not nuclear weapons per se, nor is it the states that possess or develop them. The real enemy that we must confront is the ways of thinking that justify nuclear weapons. The readiness to annihilate others when they are seen as a threat or as a hindrance to the realization of our objectives. So from here, you can see that both Mr. Toda and Mr. Ikeda had keenly discerned the true nature of nuclear weapons. Therefore, when we look at this issue from this very fundamental perspective, so although there are certainly external evils, nuclear weapons that need to be eliminated, we need to confront and eliminate them, but ultimately it is really about the evil in our own hearts, or you could say the nuclear weapons, the nuclear bombs within our hearts, where the real battle must be waged. So I believe that NGOs and faith-based organizations do share a common and universal goal of a just and peaceful world, and would agree, that nuclear weapons are incompatible with the values upheld by our respective principles of faith traditions. In fact, this year, in commemorating the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Soka Gakkai International, together with 189 faith-based communities, issued a joint interfaith statement. And in part, the statement says, as a wide coalition of faith-based communities from around the world, we have committed to speaking with one voice that rejects the existential threat to humanity that nuclear weapons pose. We reaffirm that the presence of even one nuclear weapon violates the core principles of our faith traditions, of our different faith traditions, and threatens the unimaginable destruction of everything we hold dear. So now, please allow me, because I was requested to share about some of the activities or initiatives that SGM has been doing in this regard. So, of course, there has been a wide range of activities that we have been conducting, but the core focus remains throughout the same, and that is to provide platforms for education, learning and dialogue. So this is because we believe that ultimately, the most fundamental and surest way to peace and disarmament hinges upon transforming people's hearts and minds. So we have held peace lectures, peace talks and seminars. In fact, the first ever peace lecture that SGM had held was way back in 1997 on the topic of a world without nuclear weapons. And it was delivered by none other than Dr. Ronald McCoy. And we have been deeply inspired by the passion, the dedication, and the vision of Dr. McCoy, who was an obstetrician who wanted to ensure the world in which the babies he had delivered would be free from the threat of nuclear weapons. And in fact, we are very proud that he was also the person who gave birth to the establishment of ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. So over the years, we have also invited other speakers and to talk about non-violence, like the grandson of Mahatma Gandhi, Dr. Arun Gandhi. We also had speakers like Professor Zulkifli Abdul Razak, who is director of IIUM, the International Islamic University of Malaysia, because his father was the sole survivor of the atomic bombing in Hiroshima. So he shared with us the lessons that he had learned from his father. And all these platforms, all these lectures have been really encouraging, to whoever had attended, because they helped us to cast off our sense of apathy, and they empower us to take action. So borrowing a quote by an American author, Harvey Mackay, I remember Tantra Professor Zulkifli, he often uses this quote, and it goes, "The heart of education is the education of the heart." And that is why we hold these kind of activities. So besides that, we have also collaborated with other organizations and universities to hold such events. So this year, due to COVID-19, we could not meet physically. So instead, we held a webinar recently, and a special emphasis was given on the topic of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So the other thing I'd like to share is one of the most important tools to promote nuclear disarmament and peace is the anti-nuclear exhibitions. So the exhibition that we currently use is called Everything You Treasure for a World Free from Nuclear Weapons. And this exhibit was created by Soka Gakkai International together with ICAN. And this set of exhibition examines nuclear weapon issues from various perspectives. So when we collaborate with educational institutions, what happens is that the students there, even as young as primary school kids, all the way up to university students, they would be trained to become narrators for the exhibition. So they learn, and then they share with their friends, with their teachers and other visitors during the exhibition. And many students also were shocked to learn that nuclear weapons still exist in this era. Most of them may start off with a lack of awareness, or even a very pessimistic outlook. But through this process of dialogue, of learning, they were able to break through that sense of powerlessness, and they were determined to be more aware about their own ways of life. And I recall a group of young students saying that this exhibition, being part of this exhibition actually challenged them to ponder about their own daily behavior and to be more conscious, more aware of the violence that they may be creating consciously or unconsciously in their daily life. These are some pictures. These are more pictures about on the exhibition that were held in out in the community. Okay. And during these exhibitions, we occasionally show screenings of testimonials from hibakushas, the victims of atomic bombings. For your information, the Soka Gakkai in Japan had interviewed survivors and compiled these testimonials in DVDs and also in books. And some are available online in the website called The People's Decade for Nuclear Abolition. But I think what is really important is that when you listen and learn, when you hear the victims talk about their painful experiences, it really gets to your emotion. Their cries are a call to ensure that such tragedy must never ever happen again. Okay, the other thing I'd like to talk about is our effort to engage more young people. So as mentioned earlier, Mr. Toda, the second president, chose to make his declaration calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons in front of 50,000 youth. And this really emphasizes the importance of young people. We really need to reach out to multi-generational groups of people and with special emphasis on the young, because the issues of nuclear abolition affects everyone and affects our future. So for over the years, SGM's youth division and student division have been studying the annual peace proposals that SGI President Daisaku Ikeda submits to the United Nations. And then they will hold forums, where they talk about global issues, including issues related to nuclear weapons abolition. So this has been one of the key events which have been consistently garnering engagement from the youth. And this year, we also had a group of junior division or primary school children from SGM who did research, they studied, and they held weekly online discussions about this issue. And this resulted in a talk show. So when we came to the question about what can kids do, and one of the key things that we took away from those sessions is that our daily habits do matter. So we really need to reflect and transform those little habits in our daily lives, habits that may contribute to violence, bullying, disrespect, which really is the base of all evils. So you can watch this small but mighty peace advocates when you visit SGM broadcast channel on YouTube. And other activities include petition drives, awareness survey, as well as a run event called the Run for Peace. So the Run for Peace events were held biannually in the month of September to commemorate Mr. Toda's declaration calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons. So SGM members would go out and to promote the run and have dialogues with the people in their communities to talk about peace, to share about issues revolving around nuclear weapons. And in last year's run, we managed to get 11 Malaysian parliamentarians and state assembly representatives to sign the ICAN parliamentary pledge to show their commitment to the treaty to ban nuclear weapons. Okay, and this year, we also launched a new social media platform called Rakan TPNW, which means Friends of TPNW. We realized that social media is a powerful tool to engage more people in conversations around nuclear weapons abolition, as social media has become integral to daily life to most people, especially the young. So please, check out our Rakan TPNW page on Facebook and Instagram. And besides that, we have also found that it's very important to find creative approaches, new approaches and new collaborations, so that we can reach out to more people, especially to those who may not know anything about this issue. So for example, this year, Rakan TPNW collaborated with a very talented young dance choreographer, Jasi, and her dance hub called Tari Now Malaysia to present a series of online dance tutorials which embedded the themes revolving around nuclear weapons in the dance movements. So the program culminated in an online performance that brought together 9 amazing dance and music artists from diverse backgrounds. So the aim was to use the power of art, the power of dance, to create awareness about the devastating impacts, the untold sufferings of the hibakushas, the need to stop being silent, and to voice out our wish to respect life and ban nuclear weapons. So in fact, for your information, the choreographer was actually inspired to work on this project after reflecting on her visit to our anti-nuclear exhibition some time ago. And she shared that as a young woman, she was horrified to learn about the impacts of nuclear testings, especially on the female body. She saw how babies affected by radiation, when they were born, did not look like babies. They did not look like human beings at all. Instead, they were born as deformed objects, and some were also called jellyfish babies because their skin were transparent and they had no bones. So as a woman who hoped to also have her own children one day, she could only imagine the pain and the suffering of these other women. So that experience was deeply etched in her life. So it's also important to work with others. The outreach sessions organized by Wisma Putra, by the Multilateral Security Division of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Malaysia, provided a great opportunity for us to extend our networks with like-minded people and organizations in the promotion of nuclear disarmament. And in fact, it was there that I had the wonderful opportunity to meet most of you. So it was really, really encouraging to meet and learn and be inspired by the work that you do. So we are very pleased to share that SGM had also recently released a documentary on the 24th of October, which is United Nations Day. And it was also the day that Honduras, the 50th country, ratified the TPNW. This documentary featured Dr. Ronald McCoy, Professor Zulkifli Abdul Razak, our Mr. Zahid Rastam, and myself. So this documentary is called Our Journey Towards Nuclear Disarmament, shows the collective efforts of different stakeholders in Malaysia in our shared goal to eliminate nuclear weapons. We hope that this documentary will inspire more people to join us in this shared vision for a peaceful world. So to conclude, I would like to take this opportunity to share with you that exactly 20 years ago, this month, the president of Soka Gakkai International, Mr. Daisaku Ikeda, he came to Malaysia as he was conferred an honorary doctorate of letters from University Putra Malaysia, recognizing his contribution to peace. And in his acceptance speech, he spoke about the importance about serving humanity. And I would like to quote part of that speech. And he says, "The key is to return to the most fundamental point of departure. In other words, the importance of contributing to people's welfare, to the development of youth, and to the happiness of humankind, and to pool our wisdom and energy and take concrete action. I believe this applies to all areas of society, and that it is the way to overcome the sense of hopelessness." So let's go back to our prime point of our purpose and our work, so that humanity will be protected and can continue to flourish while enjoying their dignity of life. And finally, SGI President Daisaku Ikeda also said that in order to eradicate the structural violence that can be found all over the world now, we must weave a protective net, and a protective net. So for its vertical threats, we will call up the spiritual power that arises from the depths of the life inside each of us. For its horizontal threats, we will stretch layer after layer, dimension after dimension of the linked hearts of all citizens of the world. Our net will be a spiritual, anti-war, anti-nuclear zone that extends over the entire globe, leaving no part unprotected. So we must believe that the action that each of us take does have the power to affect change. And when we link and work together in solidarity, that power will be amplified and be even more widespread. So with that, I thank you. And I would like to end my speech here.
For sharing what been done by Soka Gakkai in terms of this anti-nuclear weapon. We would like to invite Cikgu Azmi Abdul Hamid, President of MAPIM. Cikgu Azmi, please.
Yes, thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullah. Good evening. I'm clear? You hear my voice?
Yes, please.
All right, thank you. I will be very short, concise. Thank you for the invitation. Now, this year will mark the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombings. Now, we call it bombing because it was a bomb. It was brought down, it was dropped over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But we know for a fact now the advanced technologies that you don't have to drop anything. You just shoot it from your place and it goes from ground to air and goes to the target. So that's even worse. Now, this bomb had left an indelible mark on humanity's conscience and consciousness. And this year's 75th anniversary is also a forceful reminder of the catastrophic and lasting human cost of nuclear weapons. Now, I must argue, despite this legacy, we still have countries going after these destructive weapons. Up to this day, we continue hearing news of nuclear proliferation or the possession of such weapons, especially in the Middle East, South Asia, Russia, and North America. Now, this development suggests humanity may have yet to learn from the catastrophic use of nuclear weapons. Instead, what we are witnessing during our contemporary times is the race to possess such a weapon in the name of national defense. Now, MAPIM is an organization, it's an umbrella organization of about 200 organizations. We came into birth 16 years ago. And our aim is for justice and peace. And we always have this interaction and engagement to see the gamut of so many issues in the world that relates to human sufferings. And one of which is this discussion on the this proliferation or this treaty of non-proliferation. Now, we are very serious about this issue because as the speaker before me mentioned that the awareness and this understanding of this issue has been very remote. If you talk to people on the street, probably there will be a very small number of people really taking into this issue or something very personal. But the reach out has more space that we should cover. And therefore, what MAPIM is doing now is looking at the profile of people around us, the community that we have. How do we communicate with them? Which this issue is not really a complicated issue. You can show them pictures and also a lot of visuals and how this can strike the nation. But again, because this is a faraway issue from them, they only see it in the film. They only probably see this as something like a movie. But then again, we still have to reach them to the people. So the MAPIM's adventure is to see the profile of people that we should be trying to reach. And one of the constituency that we should be reaching are the faith groups, because people are very close to their faith at a certain extent, and that the faith defines their perspective of what they see around them. And therefore, we are very, putting our effort in going to all the faith groups and talking to leaders at the grassroots. So one of the major ones, because we are from an Islamic organization, we are working very closely with our masjid and our suraus. And it is very fascinating in our experience when people really wanted to understand this even term, this nuclear thing, because they've been listening about nuclear technology, but they have not actually understood how it becomes a weapon. And therefore, I think to simplify our messages in the form of a more visual kind of thing is very important, working with the people at the grassroots level. Another point that I want to share is that while we have to follow through all these debates and all these mechanisms of treaties, and people are signing on, and this enforcement of it will come within the next probably less than 30 days or so, or more, a little bit more. But yet the understanding of how the government is moving forward on this issue, of course, has also to be related to our legislators. Out of the 222 legislators now who are having their sitting, I doubt that many would really understand this issue. And yet they are the people who will make the, who will build their opinions and then derive at the decision. And I think talking to these people from their own constituencies, I mean, each parliament would have their own people, their voters are there, and politicians are very sensitive about the voters. So if we can actually talk to them, that they have a strong mandate to always educate their constituencies about what's happening to the world, and the issue of this nuclear weapon is a very critical issue. I think we should then relate to these people, and this should be another way of extending our message. Another point probably is also, there's a lot of discussion in Malaysia now. We are talking about what's happening to the world now, what's happening to people now, where a lot of sufferings, you can see a lot of people losing their homes, and there are more than probably 30 conflicts around the world now. And we are talking that some of the nations are trigger happy to explode weapons or whatever is available to them. When I gave my speech in around the country, I normally would give them the perspective of things. Now nuclear weapon is a tool, but beyond that tool is the crux of the discussion. How do we relate people to understand why people decide to destroy one another? Why people decide to go war? And who are the people at the back of the stage who's actually orchestrating all this? Now that perspective is important, because the nuclear weapon is a tool, but it came out about from a situation where people are in a conflict, and vested people, leaders around the world, are using it to justify their action. It is important for us to give that perspective, to discuss about this. Then you would understand that they will appreciate the importance of us talking about the nuclear proliferation. At the end of my very short contribution is that we talk about what is termed as the diplomacy track. We would see that there is a first track diplomacy that is pursued by Wisma Putra, of course, dealing with multilateral organizations and government to government. But we also have the second track diplomacy, where you actually pursue your effort working with civil societies. On doing that, what we need to do from the NGO, from all the organizations that we are now working with, is making sure that we can really have a very effective networking with other groups. Now, we know it's going to be tedious, but from my experience, having that network is very, very important. And lastly, the interfaith groups, especially from our groups, Islam, as Professor Kamali has deliberated very eloquently about the concepts, the fundamental values of Islam, that we do not, it is something is called munkar. Sometimes we use the word batil. When we talk about this issue, it falls into that. How do you fight munkar? How do you fight batil with a system that is so powerful that decide people to take on this dreadful weapon to kill other innocent people? So it is very important to come back to that values and educate people. Thank you so much, Dr. Azam. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi.
Thank you very much, Cikgu Azmi, for your interesting, the share of your presentation right now, just now. Okay, can we have questions? I don't know whether there are few participants on Zoom in particular. There are questions from them. If they are still on, perhaps, if you can ask. There are two questions shared by these participants. There is one anonymous attendee with regard to nuclear weapon is possessed and owned by superpower. Is he or she still around? Otherwise, I can ask a question on behalf of this person. Okay, to cut short, nuclear weapon is possessed and owned by superpower who are at the upper hand in determining whether to abandon the usage of nuclear weapon. My question, given the limited sources that the civil societies have, will they be able to play their role effectively, or they will end up by providing humanitarian assistance only as today? And it's open to any of the presenters who would like to respond.
If I may, could I take a stab at that question?
Yes, please, Zahid.
Thank you, Professor. There are two parts here. I mean, the first one is talking about nuclear powers and the relation of other countries to that. The second is about civil society. But I just wanted to touch about the first sentence and the assumption that it makes there to say that superpowers have the upper hand. First of all, I don't think it's a superpower issue because some of those countries that do have nuclear weapons are really not super in any way. They may have weapons, but they also have their own sort of limitations in terms of their size, of the economy, and so on. So that's the first assumption I think that we need to take out. It is not just United States or Russia or China. There are other countries as well, whether or not they're part of the NPT that have nuclear weapons, and these countries have that. But secondly, we can't assume or think that just because somebody has something and something as powerful as nuclear weapons that somehow no one else can do anything about it. And this is, I think, where international law comes in and why it's important, because under international law, everyone is equal. And something like the TPNW does that. It does not distinguish or discriminate in any way to say that some countries are more powerful than the others. Of course, it is not just nuclear weapons, it is anything. A country does not have to do anything unless it itself decides or it adopts that sort of obligation by being part of an international instrument or treaty. So the nuclear weapon states at the present moment, they say that they don't want to get rid of it. They say that they still need it. But that's them. But that should not in any way deter or stop us from continuing to put pressure on these countries. So there are many ways that we can do it. Civil society does that in terms of the activism, in terms of raising awareness. Governments do that too when we negotiate and when we talk to them about it. So in that sense, I see a lot of times people say, oh, if the nuclear weapon states or the nuclear armed states are not party to the TPNW, are not involved, what can we do? Well, in fact, there's a lot that we can do, but we need to be patient, and we also need to be persevere in that. Chemical weapons were really sort of the stigmatization of that was after World War I, and then with the Geneva Conventions of 1925, that it was totally prohibited under international law in that sense. So it does take time. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone on the Zoom by the name of Sharifa Makarandas? Okay, if you want to ask questions, you have written on this chart or on the question. You would like to raise it verbally, Sharifa? Your mic is mute. If you want to ask, can you unmute your mic? Otherwise, we can take questions. Or do you have other speakers who would like to respond to that first question before we go to other questions? Yes.
Yeah, sure.
Please.
So, Professor, if I may add, yes, I would definitely echo Zahid's points earlier as well. The fact that there are more that CSOs could do, and not just in terms of humanitarian assistance. Lest we forget the fact that for a while, when we talk about nuclear disarmament, there has, during the Cold War, for example, there has been this impasse when it comes to the nuclear power states and the non-nuclear power states. But then at the same time, if we recall Biljana's welcoming address earlier, the fact that TPNW is a game changer, and Malaysia was at the forefront of changing the dynamics when it comes to the discussion from talking about power against power to humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons. Dato Dr. Ronald McCoy, for example, and through ICANN, he represents a group of medical practitioners highlighting the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons. Again, these are what we would call non-traditional actors when you talk about nuclear disarmament, and yet it has been able to make an impact. MAPIM, our colleagues at MAPIM and Soka Gakkai just now presented how much they have done as civil society actors in Malaysia. In terms of raising awareness raising awareness on nuclear weapons and the destructive nature, as well as, again, I think we could do more when it comes to highlighting the urgency and the increasing threat of nuclear weapons detonation today.
We have Mr. Magnus. You want to respond, Mr. Magnus, please?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for a good question. I don't want to take up too much time, and also to agree with the previous respondents with their points. So maybe just to add that from my perspective, civil society, broadly understood, has played an extremely important role in nuclear disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation throughout history. I mean, both civil society in Japan and worldwide has really done an incredibly important job in raising awareness and spreading information about what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. This has contributed to a very strong taboo against the use of nuclear weapons. So even before the TPNW, before there was an explicit legal prohibition on nuclear weapons, there was still a very strong taboo against their use. And this is, as a result of decades of efforts, awareness raising efforts done by civil society. So I think that's one thing. So I think a previous speaker also mentioned the prohibition on nuclear weapons testing, which was also a result of very targeted and determined efforts by civil society actors to raise awareness and highlight the health impacts of nuclear tests. And that also led, of course, to these treaties that limits and prohibits the testing. Most recently, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which was adopted and open for signature in the 1990s. So it unfortunately hasn't entered into force yet, but it's still very much representing a very strong global norm against nuclear weapon testing. So again, civil society played an important role in sort of preparing the ground for that treaty. And then most recently, and as noted by Aisya, I think also the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Of course, this treaty is a result of intergovernmental negotiations between states, and it's a treaty that applies to states, and states have played an extremely important role, such as Malaysia, in bringing this into being, and now very soon into force. But I think it's also no doubt that also civil society played a very important role in making the case for this treaty, and also provided vital input into the negotiations of this treaty, and continue now in the process leading up to its entry into force and beyond to be extremely important interlocutor. So yeah, just to say that I do believe that civil society has a key role to play in this work, and that it has played an important role also historically. Thank you.
And as we have one question from the FB viewer from Faisal Samsudin, and I think the question we open to all the speakers, anyone can respond. What would be the likely scenario if President-elect Biden would not ratify NPT to continue the predecessor's defense policy of deterrence of trade or anti-nuclear negotiation, for example, China, North Korea, and Russia? Anyone to respond?
Maybe I can take a stab at that. It sounds very much a question for government. It's a theoretical question. I mean, this is not. I answered this without making any comments about the U.S. presidential elections, but just to speak theoretically about can we expect any changes? First of all, the United States has had weapons under democratic administrations just as much as they've had under Republican administrations. There is a very entrenched sort of commitment within U.S. national security and U.S. security policy, both in terms of the actual documents, the laws, the policies, the doctrines, but also in terms of the sort of fundamental thinking that takes place within people as part of the US system of government, regardless of their political view. So there will be nuclear weapons there. The question was, would the US ratify NPT? I think perhaps what they meant is the TPNW. We hope they do, but at the present moment, the United States has indicated that they would not. Would a different administration change that? I do not think so at this present time, because even when we had strong movement towards commitments for nuclear disarmament under the NPT from the 2010 NPT Review Conference, which was during a democratic administration, there was very little done. In fact, there was a lot of money put in towards investing and modernizing nuclear weapons in the period of 2012, 2013. Those are things which the Trump administration followed up on. So would the US change and ratify? Realistically, it'll be difficult. This is something which I think all of us in the non-nuclear weapon states will continue to push them. But I think a straight answer would be that it is unlikely at the present moment. Now, would the US change its stance in terms of how it deals with China, Russia, DPRK, for example? We might see changes in terms of behavior, in terms of the rhetoric, but in terms of some of the positions, the tough positions that the US is taking, for example, that renewal of START needs to be replaced with a trilateral sort of arms control agreement that is not just US and Russia, but US, Russia, and China. That is likely, I think, will continue regardless of what type of administration that we'll have, simply because these sorts of things, at least at the US level, it transcends administrations. There might be some openness, there might be change of tone and behavior, but the fundamental policies would remain the same.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Zahid. Anyone else would like to respond? Okay, Otherwise, it has been a very long discussion today, this afternoon in Kuala Lumpur, and also morning in Geneva. But anyway, I think the discussions under this RTD, I think the speakers, Magnus, Mr. Hakim, Mr. Zahid, and Miss Aisya, I think all of them has spoken well with regard to the points that they have raised. And I think on behalf of the organizers, IAIS Malaysia, ICRC, and also MRCS, we would like to thank everyone, especially Professor Dr. Hashim Kamali, as well as Ms. Biljana, and all the speakers, as well as participants on the Zoom and also viewers around the world on our FB Live. We would like to thank again the speakers, especially for sharing their thoughts on this subject matter. Thank you very much again to all of you. Till then, we see you again. Assalamualaikum and a very good afternoon from Kuala Lumpur.
Walaikum assalam. Thank you.